This is the Acer Predator Triton 700. The specific model I have is actually a bit of an older one, still featuring the 7700 HQ, as opposed to the 8750H or any of the other 8 series processors which are now launching, so just keep that in mind when you're looking especially at the performance results. Now in this video we're going to be covering obviously the specs of the laptop, the performance that it provides, if I would put one on my desk, and if it's even worth your money. Let's take a look. So first things first, let's take a look at the spec of this laptop, because this thing is tiny and you would imagine, or at least thin anyway, and you would imagine that this doesn't have the highest end specs available, but it kinda does. It has, in terms of this specific model, the 7700 HQ, although as I mentioned, they will have other processor options for the newer versions available, so keep that in mind. It also has a GTX 1080. Now, there's a bit of an asterisk to that 1080, it's the Max-Q variant, which basically means that they've severely underclocked the chip so that they can put GTX 1080 on the box, but the performance level is very much nowhere near a standard desktop 1080, just for your comparison. The model also has 16 gigs of RAM, although I believe there are other configuration options you can get, and just a 1 terabyte SSD, or two 256 or two 512 gig SSDs in RAID 0, depending on your configuration. Now the display that this comes with, that GTX 1080 is going to be powering, is a 1080p 120Hz G-Sync panel. It's actually pretty nice. The overall viewing angles are pretty decent, both side to side and top and bottom, although of course being a laptop the viewing angles aren't as necessary in terms of their perfectness, since you're likely always going to be able to slightly adjust the laptop and, you know, tilt the screen a little bit so that it is a better viewing angle for you, but either way they're still pretty decent. A bit of a tour of the laptop. You have on the top of the clamshell the Predator logo, both in text and in art form, and on the back below that you have a couple of blue painted grills which do look quite nice for your ventilation, as well as your HDMI and DisplayPort ports, as well as your DC in. On the right hand side you have the power button, and I have to say that I really don't like the power button location here. I literally, when I was filming this video, went to just move the laptop slightly to the side for the camera's positioning for the display to stop some glare, and I turned the laptop off. Happens far too much. I really don't like it here, and I'd love to see it inside the clamshell, you know, in future iterations, but it's there if you want it. You also have a USB Type-C port, which doubles as a Thunderbolt 3 port, which does mean that you could run external graphics if you want, although the ones in here are pretty decent. You also have a USB 3 port and Gigabit Ethernet as well. And on the opposite side, you have a couple of audio jacks. You also have a couple of USB 3 ports, and that one that's hidden in the back is actually a recessed USB 2 port. That one is really great for all of those micro mice dongles, which basically means that since the touchpad on this is in a pretty awkward place that I'll talk about in a second, you're generally gonna always want to use this with an accessible mouse or an external mouse, which means that if you're using it with a wireless one, especially if you're traveling, you can actually leave the little micro dongle in there, like the Logitech one for the G703, and it works perfectly. It's perfectly flush and it won't break off or anything, and you don't have to worry about that at all, which is actually a pretty nice design. Now, as I mentioned, the touchpad or the trackpad here really isn't in a very ergonomic design kind of position. It's actually above the keyboard where all of your cooling is, which means that when you're playing games with this, don't bother to try and touch the touchpad. Use your, USB mouse or whatever, because you will quite literally burn your fingers. It gets that hot. Now, in normal use, it's fine, doesn't get too hot, and so if you just really quickly need to swipe through some documents or something, or swipe through some web browsing, then you can do that just fine, but it is actually a little bit uncomfortable to have to lift your hand over the keyboard and then try and use it, and there's no kind of ergonomic way to do that, so you're going to be wanting to use an external mouse for this one. Now, as with the trackpad being above the keyboard is actually right up against the bottom of the unit. This makes it a little bit more difficult to type on, at least in terms of an ergonomic fashion. It means that I held the laptop much further away from me when I was using it than I would normally do with even a laptop of this size. That could be useful, could be helpful, but when you're, say, on a plane or something, traveling with a relatively small sort of tray that you have to put it on, it's going to make it pretty awkward awkward to, you know, kind of have your hands on your keyboard and playing games or whatever while you're traveling, so just bear that one in mind. Now the actual keyboard itself is a chiclet style sort of semi-mechanical type feel. It does have a click to it and actually can be a little bit on the annoying side, especially as it still feels like a rubber dome switch. You definitely have to actuate it all the way down, and there's no sort of midpoint actuation that you normally see with mechanical switches, although I didn't have the problem that I had with the other faux mechanical keyboard that I've tested recently on a laptop, where it was sort of hooking itself and actually making it just more difficult to type. This one feels okay, a little bit on the mushy side, but it kind of depends on your preference. This one isn't my personal favorite, but it's decent enough. In terms of the gaming experience on the laptop, it's pretty decent. When you're playing with, as I said, an external mouse, as you would kind of expect to with most laptops, it is a very nice experience. It can get a little on the loud side, and I would mention that temperatures purely from gaming benchmarks saw the CPU hitting 95 degrees Celsius and the GPU hitting the 80 to 90 degree range, which is pretty high, especially for a laptop. And obviously this is a pretty thin laptop, so you kind of expect it. It was also pretty loud as well, so you generally want to be gaming with headphones on, but in the general day-to-day use, it wasn't too bad in terms of noise and temperatures, so it's a bit of a trade-off there. Taking a look inside the laptop, you can see its overall configuration and just how small the overall area is for dissipating heat, which obviously means that it's going to be a little on the louder side. You can also see why the touchpad gets hot. The touchpad is literally sitting above the processor and graphics card and is basically resting on the heat pipes, so no wonder it gets to that sort of 90 degrees Celsius, which is a bit insane. While we're in the laptop, I'd mentioned that you can upgrade the RAM and SSDs, and the SSDs actually have a copper heatsink on them to keep them a little bit on the cooler side, which is actually definitely nice to see. There's no 2.5-inch drive in here, there's just no room for it, and it has a massive sized battery. Although overall battery life isn't kind of overwhelmingly good, obviously with relatively high-end gaming components, you don't get much more than about 4 hours of average kind of use case battery life with about an hour of gaming. Now speaking of gaming, what is the gaming performance like? Let's take a look. Alright, so starting with 3D Mark Firestrike, we've got 13,022 points, which is pretty respectable. Check out the 3D Mark website to compare that to other laptops in the different specs. In terms of Dirt Rally, we're looking at 99 FPS on ultra settings, obviously with that nice 120Hz display, which means this is going to be a pretty smooth and pretty nice gaming experience. With GTA 5 on very high settings, we're looking at 138 FPS, which again, with that 120Hz, especially G-Sync display, is going to be a very smooth and very enjoyable gaming experience. And Unity in Heaven, we're looking at 142 FPS average, which again is very impressive and going to be a really nice gaming experience and should hold up for a number of years to come. So as you saw, the performance is pretty decent. If you're looking at the difference between a full-fat 1070 and this Max-Q 1080, you likely wouldn't see too much of a difference in performance, obviously just because of how sort of downclocked the GPU has to be. Now of course there is GPU boost, and if you can keep the laptop cool, then in theory you'll be able to get a little bit of extra performance out of it, but it's definitely been downclocked considerably. I think it was running at about 1001 to 1300 megahertz, whereas the normal 1080s you'd see in your desktop are easily running the sort of 1780, 1900 megahertz mark, and some will even overclock to over 2 gigahertz. So it's something to bear in mind when it comes to the graphics potential here, or horsepower, but it's still a really decent laptop. Now in terms of pricing, this thing is pretty expensive. It's definitely in the more premium category, selling for over £2,000 at the time of filming, and depending on the model you go for, you can even get as close as £3,000, which makes this a pretty hefty buy. Of course it's incredibly thin, which does kind of help with its portability, but it does have a pretty thick bezels all around the monitor or display. The webcam is tiny and terrible, and overall the kind of use case is kind of up to you if you like the keyboard down the bottom or not, but it does have some interesting features, great performance, but obviously a pretty hefty price tag. Now would I have one of these on my desk? Personally, I would say no. I'm more of a fan of the slightly smaller design, the sort of MSI GS60 and GS43 kind of style laptops, as they're a little bit more portable and a little bit kind of better cooled, and I would rather have a little bit less performance personally, whereas kind of a little bit better cooling, a little bit quieter than this kind of like, let's shove a 1080 in here and get its best performance as we can, but you know, having 95 degree temperatures on the touchpad that you know, is right in front of you. So yeah, just a few trade-offs. Personally, I would still overall recommend it as a decent laptop, and especially if you can try it out first and make sure that the keyboard's position is fine with you, then it's not terrible. If you'd like to check out the laptop, take a look at the top link in the description down below. There's plenty of ways that you can support me in the links in the description down below as well, including Amazon affiliate links, so I'd really appreciate it if you can use those when you're buying from there or anywhere else. And of course, if you want to check out the other videos, there are plenty over here for you. If you're new to the channel, feel free to hit the subscribe button too, and obviously turn on those notifications if you fancy. And otherwise, that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below, and we'll see you all in the next video.